Good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name is John Bunyan. I'm a business development manager here at the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, lovingly known as CHEM. And today we're going to be talking about getting the most from your InCAS data. So InCAS being our primary product. And we're going to be using some real live examples. And educational consultant Sue Holt will be covering what InCAS is and how the assessments are carried out and what the feedback looks like, using InCAS to get a profile of each child so that learning can then be personalised, individualised, using InCAS as a screener for gifted and second language learners as well as special educational needs, and her own experiences of embedding the use of InCAS data within a school, which we all know is quite a challenge sometimes. Now, just a few housekeeping issues before we get started. You will, of course, notice that all attendees are in listen-only mode, so please submit any questions and comments in the questions box in the control panel that you should be able to see now. Those questions and comments are welcomed all the way throughout the presentation. We'll be leaving some time at the end of the presentation to answer these and pick up any comments as well. So please do ask your questions as we're going along. And just a quick one as well. Delegates will receive a certificate of attendance, and this is going to occur roughly 1 hour after the webinar finishes, and you get that via email. Okay, so there's my housekeeping bits and pieces finished. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sue Holt. Now, Sue has extensive experience in international education, and has held various posts in schools, including Deputy Head of Curriculum, Head of Secondary and Vice Principal, and her work has taken her around the world to China, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Spain, Qatar, Jordan and Switzerland as well. So, I mean, really well travelled and a wide breadth of experience. Sue recently has left full-time international school leadership and is currently pursuing her interests in consultancy, now particularly in relation to the use of school data, which is why we're here today. Also in teaching and learning, assessment, effective CPD, and curriculum and budget planning. Now, with an introduction like that, I'm going to hand over to Sue, and Sue will introduce her and get started with her presentation. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. Well, good morning, good day, good evening, everyone. I understand that we have people tuning in from all over the world. And so I think I really understand the kind of backgrounds and schools you might be dealing with. As John mentioned, I've worked in Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, Argentina, China, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt. So I do have broad international experience. And I have found that using this data has been extremely useful in all the schools I've worked in. And if schools didn't have it when I arrived, they certainly had it, were certainly using it by the time I left. And that's actually also the case here in Switzerland, where I'm doing a 5-month consultancy. So InCAS is the interactive computerized assessment system, I think. And I find it extremely useful with younger children. I don't know, it's moving. So in this presentation, I'm going to be going through what InCAS is, how the assessments are carried out, who is the feedback for, what does it look like, and how can we use it for all students, of course, but also for screening for gifted, those with English as an additional language, and those with special educational needs. And I'm going to be using some real examples from a school I worked at in China many years ago, so that students were really well grown up by now. But it was a very interesting exercise to carry out, and did identify so many issues. So what is InCAS? So it's a computerized adaptive test for 5 to 11-year-olds. It could also be used in the very early years of secondary education as a screener, because it does give you so much information. It provides measures for reading, and of course, literacy is the key to the curriculum. If they don't really understand what they're reading is very hard for them to progress in any area. Spelling, maths, including mental arithmetic, and it also gives a measure of developed ability. I'll talk more about that a bit later on. The reading, spelling, and the maths are linked to what they've been taught, whereas the developed ability is a measure of how well they will cope with the curriculum that you're providing, and is if it's provided in English. And it's not something you can teach. And there's also a section on attitudes to reading, maths in school. I won't be going into that in this presentation, but it literally asks students in a series of smiley faces how they feel about, different icons, how they feel about different things, which can be really interesting for students who might be struggling in reading maths or having social difficulties. So how are they carried out? Well, the assessments are computerized, so each child needs a computer and headphones. The different modules can be taken on different days because you don't want very young children to get tired out sitting in front of a computer screen. And they take about 20 minutes each. The tests are adaptive and they're therefore individualized for each child. Now, an adaptive test means that no two children get the same questions because the question they get next depends on the answer to the previous one. This makes them very efficient and reduces stress. I found that when I was trialing this actually at a school in Spain, and there was one little boy who was really weak. He was struggling in all aspects, and the idea of him having to do a test, was terrifying. But he sat down at the computer, put the headphones on, and it was a game. He really enjoyed it. And because the test was adaptive, he wasn't faced with lots of things he couldn't do. And so he finished quite early because he really couldn't answer very many questions, but it was adapted so he wasn't given a sense of failure. And of course, it has wonderful little things like when they finish a module, there's a kind of a round of applause. Well, he was absolutely delighted because it was the very first time he'd finished an assessment first, and he'd be given a round of applause. So it was not at all stressful. I know we hear a lot about students being under stress. This isn't stressful at all. It's quite a fun activity. So how does it really work? And this might help explain it. So the children are presented with a question. If they get it right, they're given a harder one. If they get it wrong, they're given an easier one. And this goes on until their level is established. So here we have a child who is above average. So she's given the first question on the test, and she gets it right. So she's given a harder one. She gets that one right. So she's given an even harder one. She gets that one right. A very hard one, which she gets wrong. So she's then given an easier one. And then she's given a harder one. She gets that one wrong. Then she's given another one. And that green blob represents her ability. So it's an efficient way of testing and it's not stressful. So who is the feedback for? Primarily it's for the class teachers because they will have a very detailed profile of each individual child as well as the class as a whole. Now, at the beginning of the school year with a class of, I don't know what you have in your school, 24, 30, it's very hard to get to know every individual child. You might have their reports from the previous year or the previous school. If they're from the previous year in your own school, then you can probably get a lot of information from that. If it's a child who's completely new to the school, the report might not tell you very much. Very often, reports will say something like, Mary is making good progress. But where did she start and where did she get to? What was the measure of that progress? And it very much depends on the school they've come from. So this would give you a profile of the child which you could use with any other knowledge you might have about their background to get a good starting point for where that child may go. Oh, I think I've gone a bit too fast there. Let me just go back. Oh, well, I think I'll try going back again. So it's the starting point for measuring the progress. It's also very important for school leaders, including head teachers, year group coordinators, literacy coordinators, numeracy coordinators, SENCOs, gifted and talented coordinators. I wonder whether we have any people here who fill those kind of roles in the school, because they need to take strategic decisions on where to deploy their resources. So it will identify the needs. Cohorts vary, especially in international schools. You would find that companies moving in and out can bring in different groups of students with different backgrounds. Certainly in one school I worked in Egypt, there was suddenly a lot of Italian families joined the school. And so there was a greater need for English as an additional language support. So it helps deploy resources. This is an interesting one, because if you're a school leader and you look at the data, and supposing you have a 3-form entry year group, by looking at the data, you might find that within the classes, there is great variety. You might find that one class has a bigger range of ability. You might find another class has more EAL students. You might find that one class has got a disproportionate number of children with special educational needs or who are exceptionally bright. Now, if you have learning assistants or teaching assistants in the class, do you need one per class? Or should the class with the greatest need have more support from learning and teaching assistants? So the resources need to be deployed sensibly in relation to the data you have. And it will also inform curriculum planning. If you do have a large number of students who have got literacy needs, do you need to spend more time on teaching literacy? Do you need to have a strategy for more literacy across the curriculum? So it should inform curriculum planning based on the data you have. What does the feedback look like? Well, standardized scores are given for the whole cohort. But most of the information comes in age standardized scores in years and months. They're given for each module, and they can be sorted in various ways. So you can sort it by boys and girls, from the highest score to the lowest score. It's easily sortable. You can waste many an hour sorting your feedback because it's quite fun to work with. And then you don't have to do the maths, because they give you difference tables which will show how children are performing in each of the modules relative to their chronological age. So you can see if someone is 2 years ahead or 2 years behind in these particular areas compared to the average. And if you don't like looking at a whole pile of numbers, then you get charts which will give the same information visually. And I'll be going through showing you these examples as we go through the presentation. So first of all, what is a standardized score? Standardized scores are used in tests throughout a child's education. So it's really important that you get a handle on these now if you don't already use them. So scores are standardized with a standard deviation of 15. That's when you would get your typical bell curve. So it means that 100 is the average score. And scores between 85 and 115, or that big part of the bell curve, that's the broad average range, and 68% of scores would fit there. Many people would class scores between 85 and 90 as low average, and between 110 and 115 is high average. Between 116 and 129 is above average, well above average, and scores above 130 are the top 2%, the top 2%, which is the often the standard definition of what's gifted. And scores below 85, are below average. And scores below 70 are very much below average. That would be the bottom 2%. So here's some real feedback from many years ago. I'll be coming back to this. It gives a score for reading, for maths, for mental arithmetic, and for developed ability. If we look along with the first one, looks about average for most things, really quite strong in maths. Biruk, who we'll be dealing with a bit more, looks very bright in everything. And this was a year 3 class, and our year 3 year group. And Biruk was only in his 2nd year of learning English, and yet his reading score puts him in the top 2%. So he was a very bright boy. Luke is a little bit low on his reading. He's low average compared to his other scores. Might need a bit of extra support there. Charlene, if you look at there, she's about average on her maths. Her developed ability is kind of high average, but her reading looks like it's a problem. And we can go through, I'll just give you a moment to look at those. We'll be coming back to Charlene. We'll also be, well, I won't come back to Ben, but you can see Ben has a reading problem compared to everything else. And I will also be looking at Elliot. Then for each module, you get what are called the age equivalent scores. And this is done on the actual age of, on the day they took the test. So you can see there that Alice was exactly 8 years and no month when she took the test. And in word recognition, she came out with 10.4, 10 years, 4 months, so above average there. We'll talk a bit about the variability later on, because this is not exact. I mean, if she was to take the test again, she might get 10, or she might get 10.8. There is a bit of variability there, but it does give you a picture. Her word decoding was even stronger, and most children will find their decoding is stronger than their word recognition, which is stronger than their comprehension at first. And the spelling is just another useful tool to come on from that. We'll pick out Doreen. Doreen was 7 years and 7 months when she took the test, and her word recognition was below what could be measured by the InCAS test. Her decoding was that of a 5-year-old. Her comprehension was very limited, and her spelling, there was a few little words she could spell. Now, Doreen had very little formal education at all. She was in year 3. They'd stopped teaching phonics at the end of year 2, so she didn't really have the basics. In the end, the decision was to put her into year 2 to give her the basics, to give her the platform from which she could start to develop, because she certainly was not coping in year 3. And then you can see some of the others, and by looking at the cohort she was in, you can see that many of the students were performing above their age level. So the gap between Doreen and the people around her was so great, it couldn't just be dealt with by differentiated teaching. Then to make it easier for you, you can just look at difference tables. So Marianne's word recognition was 2 years above her chronological age. Her word decoding was 6 years above her chronological age. But looking at Philip, and these are quite significant, he was about a year behind in most areas of reading. And that would need to be looked at to find out why he was behind. Again, with all data, it doesn't give you answers, but it helps you ask better questions informed by evidence. And that's a really important point to make. There are no answers here, but it will certainly help you ask better questions. And that will inform your strategies for how you proceed. So the feedback for class teachers means that teacher gets a picture of their class. They can see the range of ability. they can see the range of equivalent scores for achievement. Ability and achievement are not the same. Now, one of the difficulties there is that if you look at achievement, attainment, and you set your targets for a child based on their prior attainment, then this could lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy of under-attainment. So you need to compare their ability with their attainment scores and find out if there is a discrepancy. Are your expectations of the child at the right level? So the difference tables help identify special needs, including gifted. And the subtest scores help spot any trends. For example, if you look at the whole class and you find that they're all weak at decoding, or they're all weak, or there's a trend to have a weakness in mental maths, then that might help you inform your teaching. What do you need to focus on with this class? There's no point in teaching them what they already know, so you can spend some time addressing any trends that you've spotted by looking at the data. And the questions you might like to consider: what percentage or how many children have reading ages below their chronological age? How many have English as an additional language? And how long have they been learning English? Again, I don't have time to do it in this presentation, but if you look up something called CALP, CALP, that stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. And it's been found that the research shows it takes 5 to 7 years of total immersion in English medium education for a child to have academic proficiency in that language. They can function easily in the playground and in normal conversation, but to really express themselves in writing takes a lot longer, between 5 and 7 years. How many have math scores below average? And how does this all compare with those developed ability scores? And what are the implications of this for your teaching? So if you have your individual pupil profile, then you can start to individualize the learning. And please believe me, I do understand how difficult it is when you have, between 24 and 30 students in a class. But primary teachers in particular are real experts at having their classrooms in little table groups where they can give that kind of support. So the pupil score charts identify the precise areas of strengths and weaknesses. So in addition to all your class data, you can just pull out on one page your individual pupils' data and look at that and look at their strengths and weaknesses. And if you combine this with your own knowledge of the child, their background, EAL, you're now equipped to plan to meet those individual needs. And of course, at the beginning of the school year, it might take you a month or more to get to know the child, 2 months. Whereas this gives you a head start, because you can do this at the very beginning of the school year and you have a picture of that child within the first week or two. So what actions might school leaders take? And I hope there are some school leaders listening this morning. Well, they can focus on the trends, the curriculum structure, the resources and training. They can look at, as I mentioned earlier, are the needs in each class equivalent? Do some classes need more support? If so, in which areas? What range of ability is there? Do we need to combine classes and group them for certain curriculum areas? So if you've got 3 classes, do you mix them all up? If you're doing some work in literacy, or if you're doing some work in numeracy? And what additional resources and training are needed? What are your priorities in your school development plan based on the data you have about the needs of your students? So where to start? First of all, look at the standardized scores. Are there any children who are well above or well below average? Are there any children who have big discrepancies between schools? And what's the reason for this? Do they need further assessment? This can be really useful starting point for your Senko. And don't forget, difficulties with reading or general progress might be due to problems with eyesight or hearing. Make sure that these have been checked before you start looking for anything else. I will never forget having one child who was having difficulty with his speech and his reading. And I asked to speak to his father, and his father came in wearing very visible hearing aids in both ears. And he'd never thought to have his son's hearing tested. And once the child had hearing aids, he made rapid progress. Okay, the attainment versus developability. The reading and maths tests show attainment linked to what the child has been taught. The developability test gives an indication of how well the child can access that curriculum taught in English. It consists of a picture vocabulary test, which is obviously culturally dependent, and a non-verbal test, which is culture and curriculum free. And the non-verbal test is often the best measure of ability for children who have English as an additional language. Right, so in the following slides, I'm going to show data which was used to help identify individual children who were gifted, who needed extra support with English, and who had a specific learning difficulty. And so the discrepancies in scores can also identify children like Dory and I showed you earlier, who had a lack of educational opportunity. So these were the scores I showed you at the very beginning of this presentation. There was Biruk, who was very, very clever. Charlene and Elliot had some difficulties with their reading. And that becomes apparent by looking at the differences between their attainment scores, which are the reading, math, and mental arithmetic, and their developability scores. But we do need to look closer at those developability scores, because remember, there is a picture vocabulary element of that, which is obviously linked to their ability in English. And then there's the non-verbal test. So here are some the students I want to focus on. There's Biruk and Riker, who I've given 3 asterisks. They were extremely able students, but they behaved very differently in class. Biruk was every teacher's dream, really. He was charming, bright, eager to learn, and was doing very well. Riker, on the other hand, was totally disruptive, was not making progress, and was an absolute nightmare to have in class. We'll have a closer look at her later. Yi Qing was Chinese, had not been learning English very long, and you can see that he was a bright boy. His maths was very good, but he was really struggling with reading. Charlene and Elliot were well below their chronological age with their reading age, but their maths was generally okay. So they looked like they needed further investigation. If we look at the developability there, we can see that Charlene, Elliot, and Riker all had scores well above their chronological age. They were able students, but their achievement levels were all over the place. Difference tables compare the child's test age with their chronological age at the time of their test. A few months is not significant, but greater than 6 months above or 6 months below might need looking at, because it's likely to be significant. So if we look here at Biruk, you can see that his reading was like 5 years ahead of his age, his maths 2 years ahead. Yi Qing was nearly 2 years behind with his reading, but 2 years ahead with his maths. Charlene, 2 years behind with her reading, a little bit behind with her maths, not significant, it's only 2 months. Elliot, well below with reading, doing fine in maths. Riker, exceptionally able. An individual one-page table gives all the module data for each child, but if you don't like looking at numbers, all the data can be used as charts. And I really quite like these because it gives you that picture. So there's Charlene. The green line is her actual age when she took the test. The math score, you can see, is in line with her age. The blue rectangle is the actual score, and the lines either side are something called confidence limits. In other words, we're 95% certain that if she took the test again, her score would lie within that range. You can see at a glance that her reading is well below her actual age. The little green line at the bottom, very small there, is her developability score, is her actual age. And the developability score, you can see, is well above that. So she was an able child struggling with reading. I actually had her listen, I listened to her read, and she read fairly fluently with expression, but she didn't really understand it. And there's Elliot. The green line shows his age. You can see his math score is above age and his reading well below. If you look at it in more detail for the different modules of reading, you can see that his word recognition was quite low. He'd worked very hard on phonics, so his word decoding was age appropriate, but his comprehension was really low because he'd used all his brain power in trying to decode the words, and he needed some specific help. He was diagnosed later on with a mild specific learning difficulty and received appropriate support. But he'd been in the school for 2 years and no one had picked it up until this data came out. Because you can see he was an able boy. He was unhappy in school because he was frustrated, because he was underachieving and he knew he understood it. He just couldn't manage to express himself. Again, that was very clear when we looked at the developability scores. His non-verbal ability was really high, over 10 years, whereas his picture vocabulary, his language issue, put him below average. Yi Ching, I like quoting Yi Ching because I found he was one of my most interesting students, and that his maths was really high. His reading was low, which you would expect from someone who has English as an additional language. But when we looked at the module scores, he didn't show the usual pattern of the decoding being better than the word recognition. And then it occurred to me that he was brought up to read Chinese, which is a pictorial language. It's not something you break into little syllables and decode. And so he was pretty good at recognizing whole images of a word. You know, he could glance out the window and recognize it said McDonald's because he recognized it. But so his word recognition skills were fine. What he needed more support with was how to decode. So it identified his specific need, which helped him make fantastic progress after that. He had some extra support learning how to decode in English. Biruk, just a superstar. He wasn't quite 8 years old, but he had the developability of a 12-year-old. And Riker, again, if you look at her word decoding skills, up there with like a 14-year-old, extremely bright. And the reason she was so badly behaved was that she was just incredibly bored. And she was given more challenging work, and her behavior improved. And she became an asset to the class. She would always be a little madam in some ways, but she certainly wasn't as disruptive when she was given more stimulating work. She was strong across the board in reading, maths, all aspects of school life. You can see there that although she was 8 years old, she had the ability of a 12-year-old, but a very different personality from Biruk. So what next? Teaching programs for individual children and for classes as a whole can be devised based on the evidence from data. School leaders can deploy resources and identify training needs much more effectively. And if tests are carried out each year, progress can be measured. So if you found that they've made more than 1 year of progress in reading and maths, then they're doing really well. If they've made less than 1 year's progress, why, compared to the scores? So you can use that to evaluate the effectiveness of the strategies that you've used. Again, the data will help you ask better questions. It won't give you the solutions. That's up to your professional judgment. And thank you very much for listening, and I'll take any questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sue. I just, on behalf of everybody else, I've been absolutely fascinated to listen. I've picked up an awful lot as well. I can see some of the comments and questions coming through from our participants as well. So, if it's all right with you, I'm going to pose some of the questions that we've got coming through. And this touches on a little bit about, from an international school in terms of so the question would be, if you may tell me, how important would you say developed ability scores are in comparison to the rest, as they're not related to curriculums, as you said?
I think they're very important. I think it's useful to have both, because you've got one which is an ability score and one which is an attainment score. And if you find a discrepancy between their ability and what they're actually attaining, then you really need to look at it. I would say if the developed ability score is lower than you expect, it could be that the child just had a bad day. But if the score is higher than you expect, then believe it, because it's really hard to overperform in these tests. You can underperform by having a bad day, but you can't overperform. And then maybe you have to set your expectations of that child much higher. And bear in mind, all the research that's been carried out in the last 10, 15 years or so shows that the brain is plastic, and that that developability score is not a label for life. It's just showing where the child is at that moment. And intelligence can be grown. So it gives you, I think it's for me, it's more important than anything else, because it gives you that baseline, which is curriculum free. It's not dependent on how well they've been taught. It just shows you what innately they've got, especially the non-verbal score. The picture vocabulary score is important because you're working in English medium education. But the non-verbal score gives you a very good measure of how able the child is at that moment, and their potential for development.
Okay,
does that answer the question?
For me, it does, absolutely. It's just I'm going to backtrack a little bit in terms of I think where the questioning is. I'll try and put them in a logical order. But could I ask, when would you recommend using InCAS? So at what point in the academic year?
I would say as near to the beginning of the year as possible. I mean, I know with young children you want to get them settled into a routine first, but once they're settled into a routine, after the first couple of weeks, then I think you will have some idea of what the children are like in your class, but this would give you the information, and the feedback comes back very quickly. So I would do it certainly within the first month of the school year.
Okay, super. And I know this is a question that it's quite key in a lot of regions around the world, but do you choose to share the data with parents? And if so,
I share the data with parents if a child needed further assessment. Otherwise, no, it's a tool for teachers. And I think it's a real danger that people start thinking like an exam certificate. And that's not the case, especially with young children. It's not an exam certificate. It's to help the teacher design the teaching to meet the learning needs. But if there was a particular problem, for example, I remember Elliot, who I referred to there, who had a specific learning difficulty. I remember having a conversation with his mother and showing her that he had a problem in one particular area, and he would be given the support to develop in that area. And she was actually very relieved, because she knew instinctively, as a mum would know, that he was really bright, but he was struggling at school. And then it also meant that at home she was supporting him, being guided by the Senko. So he started to make really good progress and was much happier. So I would share it in certain circumstances, but I certainly would never put it in an envelope and send it home or email it or anything, because it needs to be explained. And I think when they're doing the tests in school, I would put it in a newsletter to parents that your child might come home telling you they've been doing this, and this is a tool for teachers so that they can individualize the learning to meet children's needs. And that's it's a tool for teachers. It's not a certificate. And there's nothing they can do to practice at home. Please don't make your child do, sit and do questions and sums at home. That's not going to be necessary. This is just to inform teaching and learning in the school.
Okay, super, thank you. I mean, from my own experience, I've talked to many schools around the world, and it's that conundrum, that question of should you share with parents? If so, how much? And if so, in which context? And the schools that I think have seen most success in this area are the schools that don't just share the information with the parents, but actually educate the parents in terms of what the information showing, what the test scores are showing, because you can see from some of the scores and some of the reports that we've seen today and that Sue shared, that actually you can interpret them in lots of different ways, and it often takes a real keen eye of a teacher to actually see those areas and understand what that child then needs in terms of developing the most appropriate and personalised response for them. So I think it's quite an interesting one. I think there's lots of people with a lot of different...
I think it's, when they have face-to-face parents meetings, I would certainly have the data available, and you might point it out to the parents, but not necessarily give them a copy, because it needs to be explained within the context of the school. But you can show, I mean, in the same way on the parents' meeting, you might have a set of exercise books out to show them what the child has been doing. You might have their workout, but you would have that data to hand, and you would say that the test indicates this, and we're working with that. But you wouldn't hand it out as a certificate to send home to granny. This is how bad or how good my child is, because it's a tool.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, completely agree. And I think another question from that point of view. I mean, if it's something that you might share and discuss at parents' evenings, it's really then quite critical, I think, for the individual teachers, not just the senior leaders, to really understand the data and what it's saying. So, what advice would you give to any senior leaders perhaps listening today in terms of how you would encourage classroom teachers to make the most out of the teacher and understand it fully?
Well, that's a really great question, because in fact it was that group of students in China who I've been talking about this morning, where the year group leader, actually the deputy head, said, "Oh, I think this is too much data for the teachers; they'll be overwhelmed by it." And I felt that was really wrong. And so, what was really important was I ran training sessions with the teachers, in general, explaining how the data was used, and then I sat down with every individual teacher and went through their data with them. And there were some who preferred looking at the numbers, and there were others who liked looking at the chart with the pictures. But they all wanted all of the data. I think it's quite insulting to say that the teachers couldn't cope with it, because they can. But they do need support with it. They do need to explain all the data starting from the beginning, how it all works. I mean, if I'd had a longer presentation, I could have shown, class charts. I could have shown real data and shared it, but I didn't have time for all of that. But then they need support when they've got their class data. I think either the head or the deputy head or the year group leader should sit down and go through it with them. And it's surprisingly quick, because it is so visual. And you can go through each child and you can pick out the points with the teacher. But I think they need all the data and they can use it. I think when the senior leaders are looking at the support for the classes, they can look at that range of ability, and they can see that this one class has got like a couple of outliers who are particularly able or particularly in need of support. So maybe you can combine those students into groups for some special work. But the senior leaders have to look at the support the teacher needed. They need training and they need support until they're fully confident and in use of the data.
Fantastic. And we've got another question in here, and I think this is a really important distinction to make at this point. But what is the difference between ability and achievement? And in that respect as well, what is, I suppose, the module that you would call developed ability?
Okay, well, the attainment data would show the actual level the child has reached. And so if you're going to look at progress, you might look at their reading age was 7 years, and a year later it is 8 years and 2 months. So they've made 14 months of progress, because you've actually got an absolute measure that they are reading like a 7-year-old now, and a year later they're reading like a child who's 8 years, 2 months. So that's their attainment data. It's an absolute measure. Their developed ability data, especially the non-verbal test. So the non-verbal test is a bit like a snapshot of their intelligence. It's a really difficult word to use. By combining it with the picture vocabulary data, which is showing their knowledge of English, not linked to their particular reading age, just how well they can understand English, that gives you a measure of the readiness of the child to cope with a curriculum delivered in English. So the non-verbal score is a kind of a measure of their ability, their kind of innate ability, which again, as I've said, the brain is plastic, that can change over time. You can be gifted at 6 and not at 16. You can be struggling at 6 and gifted at 16. Intelligence is not fixed, but it will give you that measure of their ability. And if you find that they've got very high ability but very low attainment, then it could be that they have not been taught that material and they need to be taught it. If they have difficulty being taught, then that might mean they have a specific learning difficulty which needs some intervention.
Okay, thank you. And would you say you have if you were going to describe developed ability to parents and teachers in terms of in the context of the scores that a child may have achieved, is there a, I hesitate to use the term, but is there a simplified explanation that you could possibly use, or is it something like a sound bite?
I would just say it's a snapshot of their ability, which indicates how ready they are to make good progress in the curriculum that's offered in the school. So I think the snapshot of their ability is the important thing to say. Not their attainment, but giving an indication of how well they're going to cope with the curriculum. Does that help?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. And I mean, a few comments coming in that I mean, there's a school in Delhi that they're saying that they have parent information sessions to let them know the usefulness of the test.
Sorry, I can't quite hear. Can you say it again?
Yeah, there was a comment coming through that there was a school in Delhi where they hold parent information sessions to let them know the usefulness of the data in terms of teaching and learning. So I think that's quite an interesting one in terms of, you know, if you're going to share the data, then you need to be able to put it into context and help the person you're presenting to understand what it's saying and then how you can use it.
Yes, I think it would need it needs to be handled with care, because it could be taken as a certificate. But if any data is shared, it needs to be explained. And so I think in general terms, you can run a parent's information session on what you're doing. But I think on individual terms, it needs to be a one-to-one conversation with the class teacher in the context of the child's attainment and current progress.
Okay, super.
That's something to be, I wouldn't send it home as a certificate ever. But that's my view.
Absolutely. We've got quite a specific question here. In one of your examples of using Doreen, you'd said that she was asked to join year 2 because she was weaker than year 3, which would have been where her chronological age would have placed her. But was that acceptable to the parent? And if the parent refuses that kind of solution as a consultant, what would you recommend?
I mean, I'm not normally in favor of putting children outside their chronological age. So I would normally say they would need to be supported within their chronological age. But in her case, it was she hadn't really been in school at all. So because she hadn't been in school at all, I think the parents accepted that, you know, some of the students or children in her class had been in school for like 4 years. They'd gone through kind of kindergarten reception, year 1 and 2, and then they were in year 3, and she hadn't had any formal education. So I think it's to do with the individuals, and to have that conversation. There's no set rule. I mean, she was a very unusual case, and you know, she an unusual solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's and I think what's key as well is that every child's unique, and their scores are unique, and the situation and context within the school and resources available will be unique. So it's really taking all of those data points together and matching them against what's practical and available within the school to come up with the most appropriate and relevant intervention for that child.
All this data is just another tool in the teacher's tool chest. There are lots of other factors you have to take in. As I was saying in the presentation, it doesn't give you any answers. It just gives you some evidence to inform your solution to the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got quite an interesting question here as well. Somebody who's worked with chem assessments before finds the InCAS scores really informative. Just wishes there was some more information towards chem IBE predictions. So I think we're talking about an earlier stage in education, but I know you've spent a lot of time with IB schools in the past. So how would you recommend, or do you think there's a difference in terms of using InCAS data within an IB setting?
I wouldn't use it with an IB. No, I mean, it is meant for primary. I mean, it's looking at decoding and things like that. You know, it's a primary assessment program. But the Chem IBE is excellent. In fact, I'm just running it here. In that it does give you material that you can use to have a learning conversation with the student, because they're at a very different stage in their education. So there's a lot of data you can share with the student as part of a learning conversation. You know, I've been working with chem data for more than 20 years, and so I know all the programs across, you know, all the ages, and I find it extremely useful. At times, I will be honest, the fact it's not one continuous platform can be a bit confusing, and people get a bit irritated with that. But the data is so well researched, and it's such a useful tool that you know, it's my data set of choice. I have looked at all the others. I will not, you know, do a hard sell. I've looked at all the others. I've studied them in detail, and chem always comes out on top in spite of its foibles.
Absolutely, thank you. And an interesting one here coming through, but and again, speaking very much in an international context as well. But if a child's got little or no English in terms of in language, is it reasonable to ask them to complete all parts of the test?
If they've got 0 English, then they're going to be a bit like Doreen in that they're going to get less than 4 years, you know, as their score. But on the other hand, the non-verbal test could give you a very interesting clue as to how able that student was. You might not think you're going to get value for money, because you would only get scores for a limited area of the test. But because the tests are adaptive, it would mean the child wasn't sitting long in front of a computer screen, because they would quickly find their level. But the non-verbal score could be extremely useful. And I suppose you could just you could ignore the other modules and just put him in for the modules that you think he might have a chance of, or she might have a chance of being able to understand something. So it might work for some of the maths. It might work for it would certainly work for the non-verbal score, as long as they had enough English to understand the instructions. If they haven't got enough English to understand the instructions, there's absolutely no point in them doing it.
Yeah, I think worth remembering at this point as well that InCAS in the primary assessment isn't just text on a screen. It's accompanied with audio as well. So the questions are spoken to the child as well as it being available in text on the screen. So that in a lot of ways.
I mean, that's why they need to have headphones, because obviously they get, you know, it's you can't, if they have to read it, then you've got to have reading ability before you can access it. So it is audio. Yeah.
Absolutely. One final question. I'm just conscious that we're running a bit short on time now, but who do you think should be in charge of running the tests within the school? Who do you think would be best equipped?
Do you mean going in? Do you mean taking the students into the computer room or whatever?
I think somebody who would let's call them the assessment champion within the school. Who do you think? What sort of picture, what sort of position would
Well,
be
the
best?
assessment champion, I mean, it would depend on the structure of the school. School's different. It might be the head, it might be a deputy head, it might be a year group leader. It depends on how big the school is. But I mean, there needs to be, I mean, the head teacher has to fully embrace it and provide the support necessary. There's no point in being data rich if we do nothing with the data. So there has to be a plan that if we get this data, what we're going to do with it. And so that would have to be from your strategic leadership team.
Okay.
But the people who will be actually using it on the ground, who will get the most use from it, is the classroom teacher.
Absolutely.
And they need support.
Absolutely. And we've just reached the hour. So at that point, I'm going to draw it to a close. Just one final piece of housekeeping. Just a reminder, all delegates will receive a certificate of attendance through an email about 1 hour after we've finished here today. You'll also receive an email from us containing the link to watch the recording again, and this will also be available on the website later on this week. Sue, just thank you very, very much for your time and for the presentation here today. It's been really insightful, and I'm also sorry as well to the people that haven't had the questions answered. There's been some really good ones coming through. Any questions that have not been answered in the session will of course be answered via an email, and anybody who has expressed an interest in learning more about InCAS as a product will absolutely get somebody close to you in your region to get in touch, and you can have a more informed chat, a more informed discussion about what it can do for your school later on. But at that point, once again, thank you, Sue. Thank you to everyone for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.